Okay. Hello and welcome to Philosophy Roulette number 235, where I read and review philosophy papers live for the Twitch audience and later on YouTube. Please, if you are interested, come join me on Twitch and have some fun, ask questions in chat, and we discuss. Just did another paper, but we're going to do the second paper of the night. We got a nice short one. It's called "Can Duties to the Self Bind If They're Waivable?" This is in the Australasian Journal of Philosophy. So there we go. Here's the link for those in chat. Yeah, and if you type exclamation point paper, the links will come back up. So, cool. And as always, feel free to ask questions. And yeah, my first time reading it too, and I'll just try to figure it out. So, this is fire. Yeah. Burn it down, baby. To have a duty to someone is to stand in a special kind of normative relationship to them. But according to many, a person cannot bear this relationship to herself. A duty owed to oneself, it is said, could always be waived by its bearer, thereby empowering her to do what she proscribes without committing any violation. So, for instance, I had a self-directed duty to not take a harmful drug. I would nevertheless be in the position to grant myself a waiver, and thus to escape the duty's grasp through a mere act of will. A duty whose grasp can be escaped in this way is no duty at all, or so we might think. Yeah, like, can you, it's kind of like, if you put the imposition on yourself, you can take the imposition off yourself. So, why not? In a recent article, Janice David Schaub challenges this line of thought. Schaub contends that a person can be subject to a duty even if she's able to waive it. The upshots are that those who doubt the existence of duties to self are mistaken to do so, and that those who defend duties to self by showing that they're not waivable needn't make the effort. Here I will argue that, for all that Schaub says, worries about self-directed duties remain. My claim will be that a duty from which one can release oneself is a duty that does not bind, something that Schaub discussion overlooks, and that a duty that does not bind is no duty at all. Skepticism about the existence of self-directed duties thus remains legitimate, and such duties remain in need of defense. Okay, the question here is, for me, just dumb, sort of like immediate knee-jerk hot take, is that a duty, release oneself if a duty is one that does not bind. One can release oneself as a duty that does not bind. It feels like the author is defining them out of the problem. They're just saying the ones we don't like, we're just going to call them non-binding. So the problem is, if we're just defining ourselves out of the problem, is that really a good answer? But that's my knee-jerk reaction, is that you're defining the ones you don't like, as non-binding, and therefore by defining yourself out of the problem, it's not actually solving anything. But okay, knee-jerk over. Inviability. According to what Schaub calls the inviability thesis, if there is no way for an agent to violate a particular norm, then the norm is not one under which the agent can stand. The thought is that if it's impossible to violate the norm, then there's no sense in the idea that an agent may be guided by it, and if there's no sense in the idea that she may be guided by it, then she does not stand under it in the way that agents characteristically stand under norms. Schaub understands opponents of duties to self to be appealing to this thesis, objecting that it would be impossible to violate any such duty given the bearer's capacity to waive it. The best evidence for this reading comes from Marcus Singer, who writes, "To promise oneself to do something just is to be strongly resolved to do it, and if one were to change his mind and not do what he intended, he would not have broken any promise. Because a person who violates a self-directed duty, duty associated with a promise will always have waived it, there is no possibility of violation, and therefore no sense in the idea that there was ever a genuine duty in play." So basically they're saying duties are things that have to hold all the time, but if you can waive them, then they're not duties anyway. Schaub distinguishes between two ways in which the inviability thesis might be invoked by opponents of duties to self. One conceptual, which I will discuss now, and one psychological, which I will discuss in section 4. According to the former rendering, if there is no action that could, even as a conceptual matter, count as violating some particular obligation, then there is no sense to be had in the idea of someone bearing such an obligation. Against those who would deny the existence of duties to self on these grounds, Schob counters that they are not, in fact, conceptually inviolable. No matter what kind of act waiving is, it cannot be conceptualized as an act of waiving independently of the normative power of which it is an exercise. In other words, the act description of waiving an obligation is conceptually linked to this normative power. If this is true, it immediately follows that there is a conceptual gap between releasing oneself from an obligation and acting contrary to it. After all, to act contrary to an obligation to phi, one does not have to fulfill an act description that is conceptually linked to the normative power of waiving. It is simply not to phi. Okay. To illustrate this, suppose that I promise myself that I will adhere to a diet of dry foods. I possess the normative power to waive the duty associated with this promise. I then proceed to eat a papaya. This rogue act is not linked conceptually to the power to waive my duty, and indeed I might eat the papaya without ever exercising that power at all. Thus, there exists conceptual space within which I refrain from waiving the duty, but nevertheless violate it by eating the papaya. On the basis of this, Schob concludes that it is possible to violate a duty to oneself despite the duty bearer's power to waive it. Thus, there is no incoherence in the suggestion that the duty exists. Okay, so basically, if you forget that you had a duty that you promised yourself, and you forget and you go and you eat that chocolate cake you said you were gonna you're gonna try and lose weight, and you go and you eat chocolate cake and you just be like, oh yeah, I thought I was gonna lose weight, and then you're like, oops. But I mean, that clearly is the existence of a duty because you went oops afterwards. So you knew about it. And so even though you could cancel it, but the fact that you didn't cancel it, if you canceled it, there would be no oops. So, okay, so I mean, they do exist, you can say. I mean, is that really a good way to argue that duties to yourself exist? Because the difference between making a mistake and being like, oops, and then canceling it at another time, and you'd be like, then there's no oops, you just broke the rule anyway, but you just canceled the rule, so there's no oops. I mean, I guess, as far as intuitions in this area go, the idea that you can make this distinction and it makes sense is some evidence for it. I don't know what the actual, duties are really not my area. The sort of ethical commitment stuff I don't know a whole lot about, so that there is some reasonable evidence for it seems okay, but I just don't know enough about it to make further comment. But I don't know how strong that evidence really is. I mean, you're just saying the fact that you can go oopsie means you actually recognize that something existed. Binding. Schob begins his paper by noting early formulations of the argument against duties to self, specifically those articulated by Hobbes and Kant. Although he ultimately focuses on a more schematic rendering offered later by Singer, it's worth attending to the earlier texts. For there we find no mention of inviability, and my concern is that, by fixing on inviability, we overlook what ultimately worries these thinkers. Here is Hobbes contemplating a sovereign who attempts to legislate for himself. Having the power to make and repeal laws, he may, when he pleases, free himself from the subjection by repealing those laws that trouble him. He that can bind can release, and therefore he that is bound to himself only is not bound. And here is Kant. So I was going to say, I want to know what year it is, but this is a long time ago. If the I that imposes obligation is taken in the same sense as the I that is put under obligation, a duty to oneself is a self-contradictory concept. For the concept of duty contains the concept of being passively constrained. I am bound. But if the duty is a duty to myself, I think of myself as binding, and so actively constraining. I, the same subject, am imposing obligation. And the proposition that asserts a duty to myself, I ought to bind myself, would involve being bound to bind myself, a passive obligation that was still, in the same sense of the relation, also an active obligation, and hence a contradiction. One can also bring this contradiction to light by pointing out that the one imposing obligation, auctor obligationis, could also release one to put under obligation. Getting stabbed. Thank you for the subscription. Good to see you again. I saw you were streaming yesterday. I was lurking your stream. We were playing Mario Kart. It looked like you were getting your butt kicked. Sorry about that. But yeah, good to see you. Thanks for stopping by. I hope you're doing well. So, okay. Where was I? One can always bring it. Yeah, I hope you're doing good. We're reading this paper on, making commitments to yourself, and does it actually, what's wrong with come on, computer. Yeah. We're just reading this paper on making commitments to yourself, and can you, get yourself out of commitments? All right, where was I? One can also bring this contradiction to light by pointing out that the one imposing obligation, auctor obligationis, could also release the one put under obligation, subjectum obligationis, from the obligation, terminus obligationis, so that if both are one and the same subject, he would not be bound at all to a duty he lays upon himself. This involves a contradiction. Notice that neither refers to inviability or to the conceptual impossibility of violating a duty that its bearer can waive. Instead, both focus on the impossibility of an agent's being bound by such a duty. This difference is philosophically significant, for we might think it possible for an agent to subject herself to a norm and also be capable of violating that norm, all while not being bound by it. I'm finding this a little funky. Jeez, it's so annoying, this stuff. I need to get I need to get a plug-in for this. But, you can get yourself in trouble. You can get yourself into, really bad trouble, where you are stuck. You can get yourself tied up, and you can get yourself in you can get yourself in, trouble with the wrong people. You can get yourself into a physically bad situation, you get yourself stuck on, an outcrop on a mountain or something you can't get off of, and you got yourself bound up in some way that is very hard to get out of. So I'm not entirely sure of the difference here between a conceptual binding, where an imposition you put on yourself, versus a physical binding or a social binding, where you're caught with the wrong people or in the wrong position. And in that case, you can get yourself caught and you can't get yourself out. If I insult squids in front of blue pill to push-ups over my dead body, yeah, you can definitely get yourself in trouble. So that's exactly here. So it's the question is, what kind of trouble are we really getting ourselves into when we put ourselves under an obligation? And these people think you can just give yourself a pass. And I don't know if that's the case. Now, for the Hobbes, the king can give himself a pass, but the king gives himself a legal pass. He's not getting himself in trouble because he has a lot of power here. And it's not the same sort of thing that he can still get himself a pass. But he can still get himself in a lot of trouble. And Kant is always up in the clouds. So it's I'm not entirely sure that he understands all the implications of that's going on when you sort of take on certain obligations, and the trouble that you can get yourself into by taking on responsibilities and obligations. So it's I'm not entirely sure about what's going on with the concept of obligation here. And the inviability that the author's talking about, I'm not even sure about what the author means, but it's you can't violate those obligations. Well, I think there's some sort of gray area here. Okay, but continuing. Consider an analogy. Let's get more of bloopiness. Consider an analogy. A philosopher queries whether an agent can truly detain herself with a set of handcuffs insofar as she possesses the keys. She can, of course, cuff herself to the desk. Furthermore, she can perhaps subject herself to a rule specifying that she remains chained to the desk, a rule that she can violate by unlocking her cuffs and leaving the precinct, all while continuing to subject herself to the rule. Perhaps because she enjoys being someone who breaks rules, even her own. But she could toss the keys, too. Okay. Even if we grant all of this, her situation is still very much unlike that of a person cuffed to the desk without the keys. For, unlike the keyless detainee, whether she remains in the precinct is ultimately up to her. In this sense, she is not actually bound at all, and in some sense, a person who isn't bound cannot be genuinely detained. Alright, that's fine. A person said to owe duties to herself, we might worry, is like a detainee in possession of keys to her own handcuffs. I don't love this analogy. It seems very black and white. It's like locked and unlocked. Like I was saying earlier, I think there's like some gray area here, but that's okay. Let's see where this author is going with it. For even if there is sense in the idea that she subjects herself to a standard and in the claim that she might violate that standard, whether she is ultimately held to the standard at all is something that is within her power to determine. Thus she finds herself in a normative situation very unlike being interpersonally obligated. Return to our dieter discussed in section 1. Perhaps she can successfully violate her promise to herself by eating papaya while refusing to waive the promise. But the power to escape the promise's normative force is located in her own will. Her normative situation is thus very different from one in which a will distinct from hers decides whether this necessity will remain in force, as it's not simply up to her whether she is held to the standard. Again, what's the consequence here? Like if you say, I'm not going to eat that cake, and then you eat the cake, and you're like, oopsie, I ate the cake. And if someone says you're not to eat any, you're only allowed to eat dry foods, and then our lady here goes and eats a papaya, which is not a dry food, and the person's like, well, that was very bad of you. Oopsie. It's like, well, exactly what is the, I think there's a question of what exactly we mean by violating it. It's like, is there consequences here, or are we just going to be like, Okay, continuing. Given the context in which earlier thinkers voiced arguments against duties to self, the focus on binding is unsurprising. Hobbes is interested in whether law could play the same role for the lawmaker that it does for a typical subject. That the lawmaker could always avoid its force through a mere act of will suggests that it could not play the same role, since typical subjects are compelled by the law regardless of what they will. Kant, on the other hand, is interested in showing that the form of normativity exhibited in a person's relationship to herself is the same as that exhibited in interpersonal relationships, ultimately because he thinks that the normative relationship to oneself is metaphysically prior to one's normative relationship to others. Since being bound is an essential feature of one's normative relation to another, it is crucial for him to show that a person can be bound by herself, hence the focus on binding. Schofield shows that it's conceptually possible to violate a standard to which one subjects oneself, even if one possesses the power to waive it. What he doesn't show is that it's possible to be bound by a duty owed to oneself when one possesses the power to waive it. If being bound is essential to being obligated, Schofields' argument leaves duties to self in need of vindication. Okay. Just because it's conceptually possible, it's not that it. All right, let's continue. Let's just see. I'm going to find out exactly what the inviability is here. Psychological inviability. As mentioned above, Schofield discusses another rendering of the argument against duties to self, which claims that they are incoherent because they are psychologically inviolable. Yeah, see, this is what I was saying. What is the conceptual version here? It's psychological, I guess. Any motive for not fying is equally a motive for releasing oneself from an obligation to fy, and vice versa, so that whenever my motivation is sufficient to make me not fy, it will also be sufficient to make me to release myself from an obligation to fy. So if I don't want to eat case, calamari should be illegal. Weren't we just talking about this because yeah, you were just talking about this on your stream that like squids are too smart. So all right, so we should not eat squid, but then if I eat squid, I can like be like, well, then I didn't have sufficient motivation, so I can just release my obligation to it. Yeah, because I feel bad because squids are too smart. We shouldn't be eating the squids because they're too darn smart. Avarice should be illegal. Avarice is illegal. Welcome, Aristotle. Thanks for stopping by. How are you tonight? I'm drinking some extremely dry wine and reading dry philosophy. Thank you to Marshall for making that joke earlier. Oh, someone has sex. Thank you for announcing that you've had sex. Amusing myself. Yeah. No, that was the best joke of the night to Marshall. Don't feel bad. Thank you. Okay, so what were we talking about? And we're beating up on Kant because that's what we do. Alright. Alright, so if you have a reason for not eating squid, but then if you eat it, then you also have the sufficient motivation to release your obligation from eating squid. I know you didn't mean that, but it was still good. It was the best comment of the night. Yeah, that's one of the fun things, Valpo, is that you get very close to some very TOS subjects in philosophy. So this is I guess, 18-plus stream now. Bound by morality, gagged by truth. Well said. Alright, so here's one way to reformulate that thought. If I have a duty to myself to stand up to a bully, whatever cowardly motive might inspire me to violate. No, you can be 18 plus. You just can't partake at 18, but you can watch. Whatever cowardly motive might inspire me to violate that duty will equally inspire me to waive it. Thus, even if there exists conceptual space within which act against a duty. Yeah, because, I mean, you can serve here in the country at 18, but you can't drink it. While declining to waive it, no coherent individual would do so. Yeah, well, you could just also be a masochist. So now we're getting into masochism. So if you could actually violate your own rule because you like the pain of violating your obligations. And so you'd be like, now you're just a masochist and you like it. So you don't have, like, this coherence here is not particularly, I don't actually buy this. Like, you can be coherent, but you're a coherent masochist. Yep. Schab discusses this reading of the argument against duties to self in the context of my own work. I myself have defended such duties, but, contra Schab, I hold that their existence depends on their being unwaivable. In the paper of mine on which Schab focuses, I attempt to vindicate duties to self that are diachronic, such as those protecting one's future well-being from one's present action, by arguing that they could not be waived. The strategy that I employ exploits the notion of a temporal perspective. Because it is impossible, I argue, to obtain a waiver from a future perspective, whose interest the duty is meant to protect, an agent can be duty-bound from her present perspective. What? Really? You argue that you know what your future understanding is? Huh, okay. I mean, my future self tells my current self to do whatever the hell I want. But this move I maintain is not available to someone attempting to argue for synchronic self-duties owed by a person to herself at a particular time. For even if we can identify multiple perspectives that a person occupies at a single moment, perhaps associated with various roles or practical identities, she would seemingly be able to waive any duties associated with them. Schab writes thus. We might paraphrase Schofields' complaint as follows. Since access to the perspectives correspond to our practical identities is not restricted to specific points in time, we will release ourselves from any obligation to phi that is generated by these perspectives as soon as our motives are strong enough to make us not phi, regardless of which perspectives it is to which these motives are attached. In particular, Schofield seems to think that I will release myself from my obligation to go to the gym today from my perspective as an athlete as soon as my motive to continue working on my paper is strong enough to make me act against that obligation, although this motive belongs to a different perspective, my perspective as a philosopher. So characterized, my complaint appears to rest. So like when I'm just like really want tasty food, I can eat the calamari. But like for my perspective of being like a moral person, I should not eat the calamari. And since these two things were orthogonal to each other, I can do whatever I want. So characterized, my complaint appears to rest on the worry that any synchronic self-duty would be psychologically inviable. Schaub thinks that I'm mistaken to have such concerns. His argument runs as follows. Motives from one's perspective qua athlete can conflict with motives from one's perspective qua philosopher. That's what I was just saying. So as someone who likes to eat calamari versus someone who makes an attempt at being moral. Because it's possible for an individual to have, at a single moment, both a motivation to perform an action and a motivation to withhold the waiver. Qua philosopher, she might be motivated to read and to demand of herself that she do so. Qua athlete, she might be motivated to exercise rather than to read. Because the obligation to read is generated from her perspective qua philosopher, this is the perspective from which she would need a waiver. But from this perspective, she is not motivated to issue the waiver. Nevertheless, qua athlete, she might be motivated to act against the obligation and thus to spend the day exercising. So it is psychologically coherent for her to act against the demand and to violate the obligation. No threat is posed by the argument against duties to self. My complaint can thus be dismissed if it's read as concerned with psychological inviability. However, I believe that the complaint remains in force insofar as it pertains primarily to whether putative obligations at a particular time can bind. Consider that, regardless of the psychological possibility of her violating the duty to read, our imagined philosopher-athlete would never possess the power to avoid the necessity of the duty. For it is she herself who occupies both perspectives, and it is she herself who exercises her will from them. When the moment for action arrives, she might or might not be motivated to release herself, just as a person in possession of keys to her own handcuffs might or might not be motivated to release herself. But the individual person with her singular will, able to occupy either perspective at a singular moment, ultimately wields the power to avoid the necessity associated with the obligation, regardless of whether she is motivated to exercise. As such, in the moment when she must act, she is not bound. Okay, so this is saying, look, even if you have multiple perspectives, you have a moment where you act, and in that moment you do not have multiple perspectives. Okay. Ugh. In a later article, I discuss in more detail the worries about synchronic duties voiced above. Vindicating duties to the self, then, will require showing that there exist practical identities that bring with them some kind of necessity, that is, identities that bring with them obligations that cannot simply be waived by the person to whom they are owed. If such practical identities exist, and if a person makes demands from the perspective of one of them, then the duties that they generate will be unwaivable, and we'll have found a way of defending synchronic duties to the self. I proceed to argue that there do indeed such practical identities, but crucially, my point is that this is the sort of account that is needed in order to show that a person can be bound by an obligation to herself. To simply point, as Schaub does, to the conflicting motivations associated with different practical identities or roles would be insufficient. Okay, so the author here is saying, look, you have to make a decision at some point. That decision happens at one spot where you have to make a decision, and you don't have multiple. You only have at that one point your one perspective of deciding then. So you have like different selves or whatever that you might have to have an obligation to your future self at a point, and therefore that would explain how you would be bound if you had a situation where you had an obligation to your future self, and that was the obligation you were you had to decide about at some moment. I mean, I don't know if how much obligation I have to future selves. I mean, there's lots of arguments that say, well, really weird things, really. There's the old argument that if, we kill all of humanity, well, then there's no humanity to suffer, and you're not actually harming anyone. There are no future people that you're harming, and therefore, there's no problem with killing everyone. And that's like a weird argument, but from the perspective of future harm, there is no future harm at that point. So it's like, what obligation do I have to my future self? Like, if I drink too much wine tonight, I'm going to have a terrible morning tomorrow. Yeah, but I'm going to have a good time tonight. So it's like the question is like, well, do I really want to have a bad morning tomorrow? Do I have an obligation to myself, to my future self? I don't know. I mean, who is that jerk? Maybe he's not worth having an obligation to. Not me. He's future me. So I'm not entirely sure who we're talking about here and stuff like that, but I guess that's really sort of like beyond the course of this paper. Let me just read the conclusion, and then I can complain about stuff. Conclusion. Schaub thinks that the ability to waive duties to oneself doesn't threaten their status as duties. He thinks this because he reads those who are concerned with waivability as being fixated on inviability. I have argued that we should focus instead on whether waivable duties to the self could ever bind. On this reading, the case against duties to the self remains formidable, successfully threatening the very notion of a self-directed duty and demanding an account of duties to self on which they cannot be waived. Okay. Yay. Done. So short paper saying, well, why do we actually, what is it to have duties to oneself? It's something that you have to be obligated because you are bound by them. And in some sense, it's treating yourself as your future self and therefore a different person. And then it falls into the more classical understanding that if you have a duty to another person, that can't be changed in some sense because, or you have a duty to someone else, then it's up to them to change whether you have the duty, not it's up to you. Okay, so this is just pointing out who is it that you have a duty to? Is it your current self or is it someone else? And is your future self someone else really? I don't know, but like this is the argument here. And so it's just sort of trying to figure out exactly what it is. Like if I'm going to eat calamari, who am I hurting? Well, I'm hurting the industry. Well, I'm hurting the squids because they can feel pain and they're smart and all that, and that's kind of bad. We try to reduce suffering and all that stuff. And so that's not my pain. So it's kind of like, well, if I want to do the right thing and I make an obligation myself, I'm going to do the right thing. Your body is a temple and that doesn't mean anything, but it's cool. Yeah, well, of course, but like exactly what are you going to do about it? It's like, yeah, I'm going to drink a glass of wine. That's not going to like really hurt anything. But if you party too hard one night, well, maybe you deserve to have a good party night. It happens. And so what if the next day is bad? That's not the worst thing in the world either. But like, yeah, so say you make some obligation. I'm going to like be a non-squid eater because as tasty as calamari is, I'm doing it myself because I think I'm a moral person and I feel like that's what I should do. And then you're like, well, I really want to eat calamari. So who is the duty in the future going to be like to in something? Is it a different person? So you're betting against the person you want to be, I guess, in this. So that's what this author is saying. Do you have a duty to the person you envision yourself to be? Do you? Like, what is that? And who would that be? And why do you have a duty to them? It's like, so to your future self, do you owe that person, the person you want to be, to act the way like that they would expect of themselves and you? And so that they can look back on themselves and say, yes, I was on my way to the person I am now. And is that a duty? I don't know. But that's what the author is saying is the sort of thing you need to do. Because if you can just say, I don't need to do it, then you didn't have an obligation. But the author is saying, look, you can have obligations because it can be obligated in this way. I think that's fair. That they're saying this is really where the argument is. It's not in the... It's not anywhere else because they're saying all these old arguments for why you can dismiss duties to yourself, they kind of hold. But like if you have this other thing, yeah, I have a duty to my psyche, and it's not so my body to go hard with drugs, I say. Careful with the drugs. But yeah, you don't want to lose it. That does happen. I once met Steve-O in an airport. He was super nice and great guy, but he took a lot of drugs, and he always says, look, he's had a hard time getting out of it. Too many drugs. Although they did just legalize weed here in New York State, so feels like something to do. Morally speaking, see, that's the other question. That's a good point, DeMarshall. It's like, exactly what is the moral loss here if you don't become the person you think you might want to be at the moment? Like, this is your imagination of the person you might want to be, but that doesn't even mean that's the person you're gonna be, want to be, or anything. It's just the person you envision you should be. And it's like, I feel like one of those like angsty teenagers that's like trying to do something. 420 blaze it. You have an obligation to go get one of those sausage, egg, and cheese sandwiches after ripping some fat clouds. Yes, that I can say I have done that before. It is a very good plan. I had it's really a bacon, egg, and cheese, Aristotle, by the way. Although the sausage, egg, and cheese are almost as good, and it does make for a good change of pace every so often to get the sausage, egg, and cheese instead of the bacon, egg, and cheese. You don't want to attack your brain? Yeah. Oh, thank you, Getting Stabbed, for the gift sub. All these flash talk about happiness. Well, look, all you have to do is come to New York and eat a bacon, egg, and cheese. That's all it takes for happiness. It's very simple. Yeah. We thank Stabby. No, I mean, but the question is like, I don't know who this Yeah, so they're saying you can have an obligation to yourself, but like you have to make up this sort of imaginary person in this author's case. And I guess they're sort of falling down on the side that it's hard. And that's fair. It is hard. And so Janice David Schaub. It's what the Epicureans are all about. Avoid the pains, enjoy the simple pleasures. If anyone tells you happiness is more complicated, they're just hard to please. Yeah. I mean, the Epicureans, I thought, had a decent point about they're feeling, what's the word? They're basically like, they feel pretty good. I don't know if like they're feeling great, but like they're feeling like they're like content people. That's kind of how I always felt about the Epicureans. I'm not like one of those people that's like gonna just like be like, yeah, content life is all you're supposed to do. It seems sort of mediocre, to tell you the truth. It's like, it's not a bad way, and actually it's much more preferable than all the bad things, but like just like this sort of like Epicurean of like avoid the pains and like enjoy the simple pleasures. Yes, do that, but there should be more. I never seem to think that was just the way it would go. Like the Stoics, yeah. Or just that with avoid reality, with mind altering drugs. Yeah, you see, I'm a cynic. I'm just like, yeah, we're gonna like we're gonna end up breaking things. Like these sort of like these very sort of I hate to fall down on this because I always do this whenever I talk about the Stoics, but they fall in with the state. They're just they're being unperturbed, which is very, very sort of like fall in with like the ruling class. And I'm more like, no, things kind of you need to mix stuff up a little bit. And so you're going to get yourself in trouble sometimes. Maybe this is just my own history, but it's like a little bit of trouble. I mean, like good trouble in some sense, to quote the recently deceased politician here in the U.S. who was worked for civil rights. Tom Waits said it better. Yeah. You're not... Well, what I would say to that statement, actually, is that you're only avoiding some of reality. You're going to end up in a different reality, but you're not avoiding all of reality. You're only avoiding some reality with the drugs. You don't get out of all of it. You're just getting... You're supplanting one reality with another, but you're not getting away from reality. Woo, H-Docs, what's up? Thanks for stopping by. Congratulations on the gift sub. So yeah, that's my general problem with the Stoics and the Epicureans. They're always throwing in with the ruling class. I'm okay. I was actually probably going to end stream soon. I just read this paper on do we have obligations to ourselves, and do they bind? Like, are we, like, if we How bad can we lie to ourselves, basically? like, can I say I'm not going to do something and then be like, it's okay, I can do it. Just one more slice of chocolate cake, it's okay. Can I waive my obligation? One more beer, that won't be a problem. That's definitely a problem. So yeah, I don't know. Just gotta, I just wonder about, like, exactly if, well, about the general ethical stuff. It's like the unperturbedness. It's like if we're just trying to be unperturbed, it seems sort of unexciting also. And the quiet life is very nice, but it also is a privileged life. So if you can just get away with being nothing binding, to be honest, can't happen. Yeah. It's privileged to be able to live a quiet life quite often. That means you are in a position that you're not being hassled by the man. And a lot of people can't get away with being hassled by the man. A lot of people would love to be able to get away with just having a quiet life, and you're not always going to get that sort of life, depending on where you live, who you are, and all sorts of other things. So it's like, if the goal is just to feel like, you're okay, it's like, well, part of that's in your head, but it seems like you're settling to, like, just, let things slide. And it's kind of always again, that's from a position of privilege to just let things slide. So I don't know, I gotta think more about that stuff. I don't know enough about ethics to tell you the truth. Not my area. Yep. Okay. Anywho, anybody have any questions? I mean, I got 9 people here. Anyone we know streaming right now, I can go raid. You don't know enough. Yeah. Well, you know a lot more than I do about this stuff. I'm constantly, like, on some topics, I'm like, hey, I know what they're talking about. And on, like, ethics, I'm like, all right, let's see how best I can bullshit this. So I don't.